Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a really deep plunge into a question that's fascinated people for ages. Could a single massive flood have actually covered the entire Earth? It's a story, many of us have heard, maybe from the Bible, maybe other places, and it definitely raises a lot of questions about whether it actually happened. So our mission today is to explore what some call a flood of evidence. We've pulled together some really interesting sources, research, articles, historical stuff, basically, to give you a shortcut to getting up to speed on this. We'll unpack the facts, the insights, looking beyond just faith, although, we'll definitely touch on how science and faith intersect here.
Absolutely. And that's the goal, really. We want to synthesize all this diverse information, connect some dots for you, and help you understand not just what these sources are saying, but maybe why it matters. This whole deep dive is about encouraging some critical thinking,
Right.
Maybe question some assumptions you have and look at different perspectives on what would be, a truly world-altering event if it went down like described.
Okay, so let's start where the sources do, with that foundational story. They paint this picture, right? God creates a perfect world, everything very good. But then Genesis tells us humanity falls into wickedness, violence. It gets pretty bad. And this leads God to decide on a flood, but with one exception, Noah, who finds grace.
And right away, that narrative sets up this core conflict
Yeah.
that our sources really dig into, the tension between believing in this universal catastrophic flood and, well, a lot of secular scientific theories. These theories often rely heavily on uniformitarianism. The idea that geological processes we see today, acting slowly, are how it's always been. It's a fundamentally different view of Earth's history. Some sources even point to a passage, Tech and Peter, that suggests some people would be willingly ignorant of creation and the flood, sort of choosing to ignore it.
That's a really key point. Because mainstream science often says, okay, maybe a local flood. Like in Mesopotamia, right? But that runs into a big problem immediately. How does life globally just reappear in a few thousand years if a worldwide flood wiped out all land creatures?
Yeah.
If it takes millions of years for life to evolve, a quick reset like that is, well, it's tricky. And it totally contrasts with what Jesus said in Matthew, that they were all swept away. Sounds pretty global.
Right.
Plus, you have to ask, why do so many ancient cultures, all over the world, have these flood stories? Epic of Gilgamesh, indigenous legends. They often have striking similarities, even a Noah-like figure.
Mm-hmm.
One source even mentioned the ancient Chinese character for boat. Apparently, it's made up of symbols for vessel, eight, and people, which is interesting, to say the least.
It really is. And this whole debate, fundamentally, often boils down to the dating methods. How we figure out the age of the Earth, the rocks, the fossils. That radically changes whether you think a global flood is even possible.
Okay, so if we start thinking differently about Earth's age, that opens up this whole idea about the pre-flood world being different, especially the atmosphere. Genesis mentions a firmament dividing waters above and below. The sources suggest this could mean a very different climate, maybe warm, tropical, everywhere, more oxygen.
Yeah.
Almost like a global greenhouse or terrarium.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how that kind of environment might connect to some, well, really remarkable finds. Organisms growing much bigger, living way longer. Our sources talk about things like huge fossilized redwood trees and Colorado trees that seem way older than their rings suggest. And get this, 5-foot-tall penguin fossils found down in Antarctica.
Wow. So bigger creatures, longer lives. How? This is where the sources bring in that theory of a canopy of water overhead and water under the crust. The analogy one source used was a hyperbaric chamber, but on a global scale. Increased air pressure, more oxygen. Maybe that's what allowed things to get so big and live so long, like supercharging life itself. Ugh.
And that directly leads to the question of human lifespans. The sources point to Genesis, where people before the flood lived to be nearly 1,000 years old. But what's maybe even more compelling, statistically speaking, is what happened after the flood. The lifespans recorded show this sharp exponential decay. Not a straight line down, but a curve. It drops off fast, then levels out. The sources argue this isn't random. It looks exactly like what you'd expect after a massive environmental catastrophe, changes in nutrients, maybe genetic bottlenecks, radiation changes. Not something you'd likely make up if you were just writing fiction.
Okay, so the world's different, lifespans are different. What about the ark itself? How did Noah pull that off? The sources stress that God gave him the exact plans. Genesis 6. 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high. 3 decks, 1 window. And if you've seen pictures of that Ark Encounter replica in Kentucky, it's enormous. Gives you a real sense of the scale.
Right. And that scale immediately brings up practical questions, which the sources tackle head on. First, size, and the animals.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so 500 feet long, roughly. Capacity-wise, think like 480-something semi-trailers. Huge! But crucially, God didn't say bring every single species. He said bring the land vertebrates according to their kinds.
Kinds, not species.
Exactly. That drastically cuts down the numbers. Think about dogs, Chihuahuas, Great Danes. They all likely came from just a couple of original canine kinds, so you don't need every single variation. Plus, you don't need marine life, obviously. Or insects, plants, they can survive outside the ark. And bringing younger animals, juveniles, makes way more sense. Less space, less food, less waste.
Makes sense. But what about that window? It sounds kind of small for such a huge boat.
Yeah, that's another interesting detail from the sources. The Hebrew word used, sohar, apparently doesn't just mean window. It can also mean something like noonday, or even light bulb or illumination. So some speculate it might not have been just a little opening, but maybe some kind of light source. Given the complexity needed for the ark, maybe some advanced understanding. It's speculative, but interesting.
And navigation. How do you steer something that big in a global flood?
Well, that's the thing you don't need to steer. The whole point, according to the sources, was just to float, to survive. The whole world's underwater. There's nowhere to steer to. Stability is the key. And one theory the sources mentioned is a moon pool, basically a large opening, like a well in the middle of the hull going down into the water. It's a design used in some modern large vessels. It could provide stability, maybe help with air circulation, even waste disposal. It's a plausible engineering solution for a vessel like the Ark.
Okay, this is maybe the wildest part. Some sources claim the Ark, or what's left of it, might have actually been found.
Yeah, that's a pretty startling claim. The sources mentioned that the Turkish government, decades ago now, actually designated an area. It's near the mountains of Ararat. Note, mountains, plural, like Genesis says, not just one specific peak. And in this area, there's this massive 500-foot ship-shaped formation. Apparently, analysis, like ground-penetrating radar and material testing, suggests it could be decayed, man-made timbers, arranged like a massive hull. It's definitely intriguing.
Wow. Okay, switching gears slightly, but still related. Dinosaurs. That's always the big question, right? Where do they fit in? It's interesting that the word dinosaur itself is pretty new, only from 1851. Before that, people often called similar creatures dragons.
Right. And one source uses this framework, the 7 F's of dinosaurs, to explain their place in this narrative. It's quite helpful. First, F formed. God made dinosaurs as land animals on day 6. Same day he made humans. Second, fearless. In the original creation, everything was very good. No death, no meat eating. So even T-Rex was originally vegetarian, according to Genesis 1.
A vegetarian T-Rex. That's hard to picture.
I know. But the sources mention, even today, you can find alligators and crocodiles eating fruit sometimes. Maybe a little hint of their original design. Third F, fallen. When sin entered the world through Adam, death came with it. That's when animals, including dinosaurs, started becoming carnivorous. Nature became red in tooth and claw, so to speak. Fourth F, the flood. This global catastrophe is presented as the primary cause of the massive fossil graveyard we find all over the world. Billions of creatures buried rapidly in sediment.
And speaking of fossils, this is where it gets really interesting. Our sources spend quite a bit of time on the discovery of dinosaur soft tissue. Researchers like Mary Schweitzer, Mark Armitage, they found things like flexible, unfossilized blood vessels, red blood cells, collagen, actual soft, stretchy tissue inside dinosaur bones, supposedly millions of years old.
Yes, and this is a huge challenge to the standard timeline. Collagen, for example, is a complex protein. We know roughly how fast it decays, even under ideal conditions. The absolute maximum survival time based on measured decay rates is maybe 900,000 years, probably much less, like 100,000. Millions of years. It's chemically impossible for these delicate tissues to last that long. So the sources argue this points very strongly to these bones being only thousands of years old, buried relatively recently, perhaps around the time of the flood, 4,400 years ago or so.
Okay, so that's huge. What's the next F?
The fifth F is faded. This refers to how memories of these creatures seem to have faded over time, but were preserved in legends, dragon legends.
Right, you find them everywhere. China, Mesopotamia, Europe, ancient Cambodia.
Yeah.
There are temple carvings that look remarkably like stegosauruses, cylinder seals, even a brass inlay in Carlisle Cathedral in England from the 1400s depicting what look like long-necked dinosaurs. The argument is these aren't just myths. They're likely cultural memories of people actually seeing these creatures before they died out.
Exactly. Which leads to the sixth F, found, as in found described in ancient texts, like the Bible. Job chapter 40 describes behemoth. It talks about its massive strength, bones like bronze bars, and crucially, a tail that sways like a cedar.
A cedar tree. That doesn't sound like an elephant's tail, or a hippo's, which are sometimes suggested.
Not at all. It sounds much more like the massive tail of a sauropod dinosaur, like Brachiosaurus. Then Job 41 describes Leviathan, a fearsome sea or river creature, possibly one that could even breathe fire.
Fire breathing. Sounds mythical.
Well, maybe. But think about the bombardier beetle today, which mixes chemicals to create a boiling hot spray, or the electric eel. Nature has some incredible designs. Sources mention the supercroc fossil, Sarcosuchus, which had a strange bulbous structure on its nose, perhaps for mixing chemicals. We don't know for sure, but the possibility isn't zero. Also underfound is the fact that we now regularly find mammal fossils mixed in with dinosaur fossils. The idea that they lived in totally separate ages is being challenged by the evidence itself.
Okay, and the last stuff. What happened to them?
Right. Well, first, many dinosaur fossils are found in what's called the Aston death pose, neck arched back, tail up. It's a posture typical of drowning or asphyxiation in water, very suggestive of a flood burial. After the flood, the world was drastically different. Climate changes, habitat loss, probably increased hunting by humans once they spread out. All these likely contributed to their extinction, just like many other species have gone extinct.
So the flood itself was the main event. How did that actually happen, according to the sources? It wasn't just rain.
No,
right?
not just rain. Genesis 7.11 is key. All the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of heaven were opened. So you have massive amounts of water coming up from underground, plus 40 days of torrential rain.
Wow, fountains of the deep bursting open. That sounds incredibly violent. How does that connect geologically?
It connects directly to what some scientists call catastrophic plate tectonics. Forget the slow drift we usually hear about. This theory, which our sources discuss, suggests the flood event itself could have triggered the rapid breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea. Imagine plates cracking, moving incredibly fast, generating massive earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis. This rapid movement would cause seafloor spreading at unbelievable rates. Continents would literally slam into each other, buckling up mountain ranges like the Rockies and Appalachians incredibly quickly.
And people proposed this before Wegener's theory of continental drift became widely accepted.
Yes. Abraham Ortelius, back in the 1500s, noticed the continents fit together. Antonio Snyder Pellegrini in the 1800s explicitly proposed rapid catastrophic separation linked to the flood. It's not actually a new idea.
Is there evidence for these fountains of the deep?
Well, sources point to discoveries made, sort of accidentally, back in the 50s, with submarine detection tech. They found these enormous fracture zones, huge scars on the ocean floor, particularly around the mid-ocean ridges, exactly where you might expect the crust to have ruptured. We also know the seafloor right near the mid-Atlantic ridge is incredibly young geologically, which fits with rapid spreading from that rupture point. And scientists keep finding evidence of vast quantities of water locked in minerals deep within the Earth's mantle, potentially more water than in all the surface oceans combined. The water was there.
Okay, so if this catastrophe happened, what does that do to the standard idea of the geological column, those neat layers supposedly representing millions of years?
It completely challenges it. For one thing, as the sources point out, that neat column doesn't really exist anywhere in its entirety. Most places are missing huge chunks, 70% or more is typical. These gaps are called unconformities, where millions of years of supposed time are just gone, with no evidence of massive erosion you'd expect over that time.
And layers can form quickly, right?
Absolutely. Think about that jar experiment. Shake dirt and water, and bam, you get layers in minutes. Mount St. Helens. It laid down hundreds of feet of finely stratified layers in just a few years, sometimes hours or days during specific events like mud flows, not millions of years. Plus, look at the layers themselves. Often you see these vast, flat layers stacked like pancakes with sharp, clean contacts between them. Where's the erosion you'd expect if one layer sat there for millions of years before the next one formed? It points to rapid, continuous deposition by water.
And the bent rocks.
Right. You see these massive formations where layers have been folded like taffy, sometimes bent into hairpin turns without fracturing. That can only happen if the rock layers were still soft and pliable, meaning wet, when the bending occurred. They must have been laid down quickly and then folded before they hardened. All points to water and rapid processes.
Which brings us to those polystrate fossils, trees cutting through multiple rock layers.
Exactly. Trees buried upright, sometimes even upside down, extending through layers supposedly spanning millions of years. How? A tree would rot away long before millions of years of sediment could slowly build up around it. It's clear evidence they were buried rapidly, catastrophically, likely in a massive flood event that deposited those layers quickly. And petrified wood. It doesn't take millions of years either. Sources mention that waterfall in Yorkshire, England, they hang teddy bears in it and they turn to stone in months.
Okay, so rapid layers, buried trees. What about fossils in weird places?
Oh yeah, this is some of the most compelling evidence cited. Marine fossils, whale bones, dozens of them, including huge skeletons found high and dry in the middle of the Sahara Desert. Fish fossils, even coral reefs, found way up in the Himalayas. On Mount Everest. How do sea creatures get fossilized on top of the highest mountains, unless the sea covered the mountains?
It seems pretty straightforward when you put it like that.
It does. And it makes you question the dating methods, as the sources point out. There's often this circular reasoning. The fossils date the rocks, but the rocks date the fossils. How do you get an independent age verification?
Is there any single layer that points strongly to a global event?
One source highlights the Cretaceous layer. It's primarily chalk, made for the bodies of countless tiny marine organisms. And this layer is found globally. It stretches across continents. Since that kind of chalk only forms in relatively shallow marine environments, finding it everywhere on every continent is powerful evidence, the sources argue, that the entire planet was under shallow water at the same time.
And the Ice Age, how does that fit in?
The sources explain the Ice Age as a direct consequence of the flood. Imagine the fountains of the deep releasing hot subterranean water, massive volcanic activity heating the oceans. Hot oceans mean vastly increased evaporation. At the same time, volcanic ash and aerosols high in the atmosphere would block sunlight, cooling the continents, especially at the poles and higher latitudes. So you get massive evaporation off warm oceans, leading to incredible snowfall over cold continents, perfect conditions for rapidly forming huge ice sheets.
So the flood explains the Ice Age.
It provides a mechanism, yes. It's interesting, sources note that secular science often invokes an asteroid impact to explain mass extinctions involving water and volcanism. But they resist the biblical flood account, which described similar catastrophic mechanisms thousands of years earlier.
Okay, so after this global catastrophe, humanity essentially hits reset. Just Noah and his family, 8 people.
Right, repopulating the entire Earth from just 8 people. And this, sources say, actually aligns with genetic evidence suggesting a population bottleneck in human history, where our genetic diversity was dramatically reduced at some point in the past before expanding again. And many global legends also trace ancestry back to a small group surviving a flood.
Then came the Tower of Babel.
Yes. According to Genesis, people disobeyed God's command to spread out and fill the earth. Instead, they gathered in one place, Shinar, to build a city and a tower to make a name for themselves. God's response was to confuse their single language, scattering them across the earth. And linguistically, this is fascinating. Instead of finding clear evidence for one single mother tongue that all languages evolved from, linguists find these language isolates and distinct language families around 94 major families, sources say. This number is remarkably consistent with the biblical account of around 70 family groups listed in Genesis 10 dispersing after Babel. It fits that model better, arguably, than a slow, single evolutionary divergence. Genetic data also shows distinct, relatively unmixed population clusters emerging around that proposed time frame. So why did God use a flood? If he just wanted to deal with wickedness, why not, just snap his fingers? That's a profound question the sources touch on. The idea is a flood leaves evidence. Geological scars, fossils, sedimentary layers. Unlike an instantaneous miracle, the flood left behind a record in the rocks. It serves as a warning, but also provides a basis for faith, allowing people to examine the evidence and decide for themselves if the account is credible. It wasn't just erased, it was judged, and the evidence remains.
And this ties into prophecy.
It does. The sources emphasize that the Bible isn't just history, it's also prophecy. They point to hundreds of specific fulfilled prophecies about ancient cities like Babylon, Tyre, the rise of specific kings like Cyrus predicted by name over a century beforehand, and most significantly, detailed prophecies about the Messiah, his lineage, birthplace, miracles, death, resurrection, all fulfilled precisely by Jesus Christ, according to the sources. This track record of fulfilled prophecy adds weight to its claims about past events like the flood and future ones.
Which brings us to the present and the future. The sources mention Jesus warning about a future false Messiah, an Antichrist figure.
Yes, someone who would rise to global power, promote a one-world system, perhaps undermine national sovereignty, essentially echoing that desire for centralized human power seen at the Tower of Babel, but on a global scale.
It comes back to that verse you mentioned earlier from 2 Peter.
Exactly. Peter predicted that the last days coffers would come, deliberately ignoring two things, creation and the flood. They'd choose to believe that all things continue as they were from the beginning, embracing uniformitarianism and pushing catastrophes into the realm of myth or the impossibly distant past. Sound familiar?
It really does. Okay, so wrapping this up, what does this flood of evidence mean for us, for you listening? We've covered a lot. Geology, biology, linguistics, history, archaeology, all pointing, according to these sources, towards a real global catastrophic flood.
And if we take that step further, the same source, the Bible, that describes the world perishing by water, also clearly speaks of a future judgment, a future perishing by fire. That's also in 2 Peter chapter 3. So the final thought is this. If the evidence for the past judgment by water is as compelling as these sources suggest, what does that imply about the warning of a future judgment by fire? Could that also be true?
That's definitely something to think about. We hope this deep dive gave you a lot to consider. What stood out to you? What questions do you have now? That's what this exploration is all about.